Hi, welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Graven. Our guest today is Jennifer Heemstra. She is the chair and professor of chemistry. She's the Charles Allen Thomas Professor of Chemistry at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research, well, I'm going to let her talk about her research a little bit because I don't know if I can say all these words, but she's also a science communicator. She writes a regular column for Chemical Engineering News and earned her Ph.D. at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So Jen, thank you so much for being here on the podcast. How are you?
Thanks for having me. It's great to talk with you. And I will say you could learn all of those words if you're willing to fail a few times at it.
The ability of nucleic acids. So yeah, okay. But I'll let you explain. I wanted to hear a little bit first, an overview of the work that you do and your team does in the Heemstra lab.
Yeah, I can absolutely talk about that. So my research interests have always been centered on a field called supramolecular chemistry. And I have explored that in a lot of different realms. In fact, in my public bio, I have the word phenylene, ethynylene, oligomers, because people use that to introduce me often. And it's fun to hear people pronounce that because they probably struggle with it as much as I did when I was a graduate student myself. Yeah. But what supramolecular chemistry means is that we are basically building with Lego bricks, but where those Lego bricks are molecules. And in our lab, we just happen to think that biomolecules, like the proteins and the nucleic acids that are in our bodies and everywhere in nature, that those are just like the coolest Lego bricks ever, right? So we've got, 4 billion years of evolution has delivered us these molecules that have these absolutely exquisite functions. And then what we get to do is to look outward and say, where is there an unmet need? Often something in biomedicine or the environment or a need for research tools. And then we have a really interdisciplinary team of researchers and we get around the problem. We kind of dig into our figurative, box of biomolecular Lego bricks and we say, how do we solve this problem? And we build and test, and then we fail, and then we rebuild and we retest and we fail some more. But through that iterative process, then we're able to harness the capabilities of these molecules in order to create technologies that can benefit society. And because we fail a lot, we usually happens because we don't understand something about how these molecules are working or how they're supposed to work. So then there's a lot of opportunities to just gain fundamental knowledge as well.
Yeah. Well, regular listeners have already figured out your comfort in talking about failure. And I will give a quick plug, and we'll probably come back to this later, to the listener. I learned about Jen's work in Amy Edmondson's book, Right Kind of Wrong. So we'll come back and talk about that. It was great to have Amy previously on the podcast. And after reading about what you said, I had to reach out.
And I will say that it all comes full circle because then Amy has been one of my heroes and someone I've looked up to for so long because of her work in leadership. And that's kind of the gap that I had to fill with my greatest mistake.
Yeah. So before we get back to all of that, want to hear your story, looking at your career, whatever aspect of that work it might come from. What would you say is your favorite mistake?
Yeah, I had to think about this one for quite a while, actually, because my most frequent mistake was just all of the mistakes and failures that we have in research. As I alluded to, and as I'm sure you know so well after writing your book, when we work in research labs as scientists, we walk into this place every day where we know that mistakes and failure are not going to be like a maybe, they're going to be the default mode. It is almost certain. And so sometimes when I talk with my classes about this or talk with people in my research lab, I start doing the math and I think, oh my goodness, okay, I worked in a lab as a researcher for this many years, so this many days a year, and I probably made this many mistakes every day or had this many failures every day. I'm like, I am a professional failure because I have failed like literally tens of thousands of times in my life. But the greatest mistake that I made actually is almost orthogonal to that, or almost the reverse of that, because it was the mistake I made when I was choosing my career path, because I chose this career path of being a professor at a major research university because I thought that it was a research job. But what I realized is that it is actually not a research job. I was very wrong about what this career would be all about. But that turned out to actually be the best possible thing, because it is not only a career path that I love way more than what I thought I was getting, but in fact, realizing that gap between what I thought I had signed up for and the job that I actually have, and realizing that I wasn't alone in that mistake, has in fact fueled a lot of the work that I do and the things that I'm really, really passionate about now.
So what would you say the biggest gaps were between expectation and reality? Was it a matter of like how your time gets allocated, what you're allowed or need to focus on? Or more?
Yeah, it definitely comes down to that. And I think it's really the overarching theme of the job, that in order to end up as a professor in chemistry at a research university, or really any of the sciences, you start out at some point working in a lab doing research. Often when you're an undergrad, you kind of say, oh, I like this. This is fun. I want to keep doing this. So then you go off to graduate school and you earn your Ph.D. And that's really all about, a little bit of teaching and a little bit of classes, but most of what you're doing is working in a lab or doing research. And then if you like that enough that you think you want to be a faculty member, well, then you go do a postdoctoral fellowship. And that's, guess what? More research and a little bit of other things. And along the way, people say, okay, there's lots of great paths you can pursue, right? You can go to industry, you can go into policy or government, or you can stay in academia and be a professor. And what people say is, oh yeah, that's a research job. You're a professor, you're a scientist, you're a researcher. And I took this job. I actually took the job because I love science, but also I do not love having a boss. I'm really, really bad at having a boss. And so this is a unique job where I have an employer, but I don't have a boss. And that's pretty great. But what I realized when I got into this job is that, surprise, I have a leadership job. And that is inherently a people job, because now I lead a team of people who are graduate students and postdocs and undergraduate students, all of those career stages I had come through. Now I'm leading a team of people who are making their way through those career stages. And so that actually should have been more evident, but I think I didn't realize everything that comes with leadership. And that has actually turned out to be by far the best part of this job. Like when my group and I sit down and we talk about motivation, we drill down each individually into, I think I frame it as like, why do you show up here every day, ... really? Like what really gets you out of bed in the morning? And for me, that comes down to, I get to come here and work with this ever evolving group of early career researchers. And I get to see them grow and learn and develop their skills and persist through failures and become experts. And then I get to see them go out into the world and do all of these amazing things. But while the science is something I have to know and be good at, really my job is all about helping people be their best. And it's about leading. And I've had some painful experiences where I realized it was about conflict resolution. I had no idea what to do in those times, but it's also led to some really, really fulfilling aspects of my career.
Yeah. How much did that change? Like did the job and the allocation of time evolve? As there's a typical path, right? From what assistant professor, associate professor, full tenured professor. How much of it was? It sounds like your comfort level grew. Is that as the job evolved, or just as you kind of leaned into what the job entailed?
That's a really wonderful question. And then for me, we can dig into this too. I've added on the step of being a department chair, which is a whole other change in time allocation, as you put it, is a brilliant way of saying that. I will say that it has shifted. The ways that I spend my time have shifted over all of those career stages. But the thing that's been pretty constant is the leadership piece. That, yes, in the first literally 6 months on the job, it was mostly me ordering supplies, getting the shipments in. But then pretty quickly you recruit a group of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people. And now what you realize is that I can go into lab and I can do things, but that's not how all of this is going to get done. If we're going to be successful, it's going to be because I'm there empowering all of those other individuals in order to get our research done. Very quickly I realized I'm like the least efficacious person in my lab for doing research, right? Like I go in there and things get broken. In fact, I say we wear these lab coats, and I liken it to the residents in the hospitals. And like everyone has these long lab coats, and they should give me the short one because I'm the person who is like the least, maybe not the least experienced, but that, I go into lab and I'm trying to do something between, 3 meetings and thinking about my email. And I'm just, I've been out of it for so long that the people in my group are really the experts. And so how I spend my time has changed because there's all of these other, as you probably know, there's all of these other things beyond then leading that research lab that are also part of the job. But I will say that leadership being at the front and center has been pretty constant since even the first year.
Yeah. So as you moved into these leadership roles, did you have to seek out leadership education, mentoring? Was it a matter of reading books and or meeting people like Amy Edmondson and other great teachers of their own?
Yeah, that's also a really good question, because one of the toughest parts about this, I'll say, is that there isn't even a realization or an acknowledgement that it's a leadership job. It's, no one at any point did anyone pull me aside and say, hey, I know you probably thought you were getting this research job, but I've got something to tell you, right? You're going to need all of these skills to run your lab. Nobody ever really tells you that. Instead, you get thrown in. A lot of people who are in this job would maybe still not even necessarily acknowledge that it's a leadership job, even though that is obviously a huge part of what we do. And so I had to learn this in very, very painful ways. In fact, I say that the day I realized conflict resolution was a part of my job was the first day that there was a major conflict in my group. And I'll never forget it. My students had gone to talk to my colleague, who thankfully was also a newish faculty member. So I didn't have one of the really senior faculty knowing about this. And she walked in my office and told me what was happening and said, if there's this big conflict, if you don't deal with it, there's going to be like a huge war that's going to tear your group apart. And I don't think she said like, good luck, but something equivalent to that, and walked away. And
figure it out.
Yeah, figure it out. Like, okay, that's on you now. And I shut my door and I thought, what do I do? I just wanted to crawl under my desk and rock slowly back and forth, right? I had no idea what to do. Yeah. And I literally opened up my browser and Google searched conflict resolution. Yeah. It's like, that was and then I realized, I'm like, oh, wow, there actually are resources out there. And it was actually a conversation. I had started kind of reading some books. I read Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, and that really got me thinking about how to foster creativity and thinking about a culture of candor. And then I was starting to do what I thought were innovative things in how I led my lab. And I'll never forget one of my friends who's a leadership expert. I was telling him about it. I'm like, oh my gosh, we're doing this and it's so exciting and it's so innovative. And he looks at me and he goes, Jen, that's just organizational leadership. And it might sound kind of pejorative, but it was actually eye-opening for me, because I realized that's how I then went on and discovered people like Amy and your work and the work of so many folks who are writing books about this that can then help us think about the culture we're creating, think about how we're leading teams, think about achieving the results we wanted. And I just started voraciously listening to podcasts and reading books and reading articles and TED Talks and the whole deal, because I realized, that's it. I have a job I wasn't trained for, but there are people out there who can help.
Yeah. Well, and then it sounds like there's an opportunity for you to lead, to educate, to mentor students as they're thinking about careers. Like if they really want to focus on the research, are there jobs in the private sector that would really allow them to do more of that without the other parts of academia?
Yes. It's a really interesting question, because no matter where they go, often leadership skills are going to be part of it. That especially for the students who are getting a PhD in chemistry, it's a chemistry degree, but in a lot of ways, it's really a leadership degree. It's really about being able to lead projects and be the person out front strategizing and troubleshooting. So whether they go into government or doing policy work, or if they head to industry to be a researcher or academia or wherever, usually they're going to find themselves leading a team of people. And so this is actually something I've become very passionate about, is not only how do we as faculty and other leaders out there, how do we lead better, but then for those of us who are also training the next generation of scientists, how do we teach them how to be leaders so that we kind of break the cycle, that when they get there, they could be like, oh, I actually was trained in conflict resolution. I'm ready for this. I don't need a Google search to help me get through today.
Yeah. And I think there's similar discussions that have taken place in medicine, in medical education, coming out of school and doctors who I've known and talked to going through their residency. And then if, they may very well end up in a leadership position. With or without formal leadership training. It seems like, there's more of that happening now, how to operate well in teams, how to lead and get along more constructively in complex workplace scenarios.
Yeah, I think something that is really encouraging and uplifts me as I think about the future of science and medicine, really STEM in general, and the future of academia, is that you're right. These conversations are happening a lot more often than they used to. It's a lot more frequent than when I was starting as a faculty. I'll go give seminars places, and I'll go out to dinner with early career faculty, and I'll say, oh, you know what? How can I help? Like, what do you want to know? And they say, how can we be great mentors and leaders to the people in our lab? And I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, this is the future of our field, and that future is very, very bright. That we're having those conversations now.
Yeah. I want to ask two other questions about, your work as a professor and a department chair. And then, I would love to talk more about mistakes and failures in research. But, I stopped after a master's degree. I considered maybe getting a Ph.D. I talked to a couple of my master's advisors about academic life. And, they would tell me about, one in particular, I think hated going to get funding. And so the question to you is is it rare for a professor to love all of the aspects of their work, which as an outsider seem to include, research, teaching, getting funding, publishing, leading others? I mean, there are a lot of different responsibilities. Yeah,
that's a really interesting point and a very, very good question, because you're right, that is a very multifaceted job. I like to say that running a science lab in academia, it's a little bit like being a small business owner, in that you have to, if you want to be able to run your shop, you have to go out and get funding. And yes, it's in the form of federal grants instead of, say, VC funding for a startup. And, yes, our plan is to never be making money. In fact, when we submit grants, we have to almost promise that we're not going to make money because of that grant, or if we do, we have to disclose it. But in a lot of ways, you're your own HR department in a way, you're your own financial planning department, you're your own strategic management department, and you have to do all these things. And I don't know that there is any one person out there who just absolutely loves all of that and loves the teaching and loves the science and loves the mentoring. I think we all come to it with different strengths and different preferences. And in fact, for me, then going on to be a department chair was saying, I love the problem solving. I love thinking about how we advance, how we work together as a department to advance towards these goals that we have. I love that every hour of my day is different, and I can go from talking research with my group to doing a podcast with you to hearing about a facilities issue that we need to deal with and figuring out how we're going to move forward to being in a budget meeting. That's really, really fun and exciting for me, but it's definitely not everyone's cup of tea. But I will say that the one thing that I think should be more standard is to love the aspect. If you're going to be in academia and have a research group, I think it should be pretty non-negotiable that you enjoy training and mentoring and teaching researchers and leading that group, because for folks who don't enjoy that, then the students are the ones who bear the brunt of that.
Yeah. One other thing you said earlier, Jen, that was interesting, wanted to follow up on, you said as a department chair running a lab, you have an employer, but not a boss. Now I'm trying to think like, well, there's probably a dean, there's certainly a university president, but is it a matter of like the amount of autonomy that you have when you say, I don't have a boss? Like, it doesn't feel like you have a boss, is what I hear you saying, or?
Yeah, I will say, it's really interesting what you just spotted, because I said I don't like having a boss. I'm found from my time in industry, I'm especially bad at having a boss where I think that I could be doing their job better than them, though I'm sure we all think that, and we're, often, I'm sure I'm incorrect often in that. But it's interesting because I was drawn to this job by not wanting to have a boss. But now as a chair, you are right that I have a dean who is actually my boss. But I like to say, and I hope my dean isn't listening to this, but I have a boss, but it's a boss for a job that I could quit and still have my job. So I could quit being department chair, and eventually my term will end and I will no longer be department chair, and I still have my job as a tenured faculty member, and I can still do all of the things I love doing. But I really like my dean and we get along great, and it's really, really fun to work with him. So I have no visions of quitting, but I often say, I have a boss, but I can quit that job and still have my job. So it's okay.
It comes through. The key takeaway is that, yes, you like your dean. We'll highlight that. We'll send that clip out.
Yes, exactly.
No,
That would be the key takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, I think people don't like being, micromanaged or nitpicked, and it sounds like there's not just academic. There's a tradition, for good reason, of academic freedom in academia, but it sounds like maybe you might even say professional freedom to lead your lab the way you want to lead it.
Yeah, that's really huge. That I often tell folks who are thinking about different careers. I often say there isn't one perfect. There's no perfect job out there, and there's no perfect job for everyone. There's no best job for everyone. It's that every job has good things and not so great things, and it's about looking at your own personal preferences and your style and your personality, and saying, what are the good things that are most important to me, and what are the bad things that I find most palatable, and then go with that. And so for me, I don't enjoy waking up at 2 a.m. and thinking, oh my goodness, what happens if we never get another grant funded and I won't be able to do my research, and is my career going to be over, right? I don't enjoy that living on the edge of always having to be seeking funding.
Yeah.
And my friends in industry will say, yeah, that's why I'm not in academia. But then on the flip side of that, if I want to take my group and have a 3-day group retreat every year where we go rent a big cabin and buy a bunch of food and we do professional development and we brainstorm on projects, I can just do that. Like, I once had someone ask me, who told you could do that? I'm like, nobody told me I can't. Like, that's why, that's kind of the academic freedom. It's not just about your research.
Yeah.
It's about you controlling your schedule and you controlling, a lot how you spend that money within the bounds of what's legal to spend it on, but you can choose who you hire, you can choose how you lead your team. And really the very, very important thing in there for me is to be able to choose the culture that you're going to create. You might have seen in the press, there's a lot of press right now about academic culture and research lab culture not being so great. And it is not great in a lot of places. And that's a big problem, but we can make it something fantastic. That, my career goal is to be part of the group of people who are shifting academic culture everywhere, which is why I want to be a department chair and might want other career stages beyond that. But in your research group, my group and I can sit down and say, what do we wish all of academia looked like? And then we can just say, okay, let's create that right here, right now.
Yeah.
And we're just going to do that. And what policies do we need? What practices do we need? And we're not going to get it perfect, but we're going to keep getting it better and better and better. And let's just do that, because then that's a place that upholds human dignity. And that's a place we want to make a reality for us.
Yeah. That's great. So let's talk more about like life in a lab. And you talk about failures and mistakes. And, I think of Amy Edmondson's framework that she's taught, in previous books of different types of failures, basic failures, complex failures and innovation failures. So, I mean, it seems like there in a lab, there's innovation failures of like, well, we disproved a hypothesis and that's science, versus, let's say, a technical mistake. I don't know, like adding the wrong chemical into an experiment. I mean, I'm thinking of high school chemistry lab. Forgive me.
Yeah. No, that's very accurate. That's very accurate. And so how do those play into our life in the lab every day?
Yeah, I'm just curious, like, is it mostly, things that, Amy Edmondson and others would teach that we should celebrate of those innovation failures? Or are there sometimes just like, oh, that was just a slip up?
I will say that it runs the whole gamut. And sometimes you don't even know what kind of failure it is. Mm-hmm. And so really we have to be, while some failures are more desirable than others, we have to be okay with every piece of failure, because the things that we're doing are often really complicated. You have to go into lab and you have these cells that are growing. And if you look at them wrong, they'll die or somehow not be doing what you want them to do. And then you have these reagents that could go bad, and you've got all these different types of reagents you have to add at very specific time points and in very specific orders and under very specific conditions to get it to work. And it's almost a little bit like a choreographed dance. I will tell people this, that, I'm not a dancer, I've actually got no rhythm whatsoever. My group will tell you, but I've watched dancers enough to know that if you showed them a routine and then said, okay, you have to go perform it perfectly the first time, right? It's just not possible. And so I think even those more basic mistakes of, oh, I added the wrong reagent or I did it the wrong time, we have to be okay with making those mistakes, but then we have to be able to move on and say, okay, I won't do that again. I'll do better next time. Yeah. But then, the bigger mistakes we say in our lab when we start a new project, like, how do I make this fail? What's the experiment that I'm going to not want to do? Because in the back of my head, I know that's what's going to make it fail. And so instead, my tendency will be to tiptoe around that and only get to it at the very end. But that's not serving me and it's not serving anyone well. And how do we just headlong into those failures? And actually, that's why I love the literature on psychological safety so much, because as a leader, that's one of the more powerful things that you can do, is to create a safe space for people to fail and to even reward those really good failures. We kind of throw a party when someone kills their project.
And that's because you throw the party because to celebrate the learning, or at least learning that this isn't worth pursuing further, and that's of value.
It's celebrating the courage to say, I've invested, to overcome the sunk cost fallacy, right? It's celebrating the courage to say, wow, I have invested my blood, sweat, and tears in this, often literally sweat and tears, not literally blood, thankfully. But I've invested in this, my time and my life and my drive and all of those days of working, and for a year and a half, sometimes 2 years. And now to hit a point where you say, based on what I have figured out and what I know, I don't think that this is feasible, or I don't think we're going to be able to do this in a way that makes it worth doing anymore. And so to walk away from that is a really painful, but yet very courageous thing, and has usually happened because someone has done really fantastic science in order to get them to that knowledge and realization. And so we haven't literally thrown a party for that in a while. A lot of things haven't come back since COVID, but as I say that, I'm like, we might need to start doing that again.
Yeah. And, I'm with you. Amy quoted you in the book as saying, we need a culture. Speaking of the culture you want to create, people can be open about their failures without consequences. I'm kind of a radical, I think, compared to the business world as a whole, where I'm like, well, it's counterproductive to punish even basic failures. To say, well, that shouldn't have happened. Clearly we didn't know as a team how to prevent it. And, punishment interferes with learning and progress. So, what do you do to help emphasize the need to make sure that we learn from the mistake, that we can accept, okay, we're human, we made what might be considered a basic failure. And I know Amy Edmondson isn't saying you should punish those failures, but the business world tends to leap to punishment. What do you do to keep the focus on the learning and maybe prevention of that same mistake or failure in the future?
Yeah, see, you are very enlightened on this. And what you're able to do, what you just described, is brilliant, right? That is stellar leadership. But it somewhat flies in the face of our human nature, at least as a lot of us experience it. And I think that this really highlights actually one of the instances where the lack of leadership training in academia for those of us who are running labs really bumps up against the needs of the people that we work with and causes a lot of pain and a lot of toxicity and a lot of people leaving science for not the right reasons. Because on one side, you are absolutely right that punishing failure is counterproductive. But then on the flip side of it, I often say, if you look at what we're doing as academic scientists, we're taking people who haven't been trained formally to any great extent, and if so, only a small, tiny, infinitesimal fraction of the science training we've got. And then you're throwing them into a situation where they're leading a team of early career researchers, people who are still making all of those mistakes and learning how to do these things. But then there's very little oversight. And we put people in a really high pressure situation, that in your first 5 years, you're trying to get tenure. Mm-hmm. Literally, you having a job 5 years from now is depending on people succeeding and getting results and you being able to get papers. And then it continues on that you being able to keep getting funded relies on you having successes. And so in a really radical way, what I would love to see is that we need to upend the entire reward structure in the research community, or at least on the academic side. And we need to rewrite a reward structure that is less reliant on the value judgment of a success over a failure. And actually, I was just in a really interesting conversation about this because as folks lean more and more on AI to create models, when we look at our scientific data, we only publish the successful data. And what's missing is all the things that didn't work. And I was like,
that is interesting.
Now that's interesting. And so somebody along the line is going to have to figure out how to incentivize publishing all of those failures. We've talked about it. It comes up, every few years in academia. Oh, we need a journal to publish all of our failures in. And I think that the justification for that is really starting to hit home more than ever.
Wow. So there's the technical reaction to a failure, that, the analytical side. And then, there's the human side. So as a leader, how do you help students or people working in your lab, not beat themselves up over a failure or a mistake? I think that also tends to be human nature.
And that's one of the hard things about leadership that I had to learn, because when someone fails at something, and especially if it was a preventable failure, as leaders, something we need but we're not taught is how to take all of that stress we're feeling, the pressure of the grant deadlines and tenure and everything, and just hold that bay over here and to just deal with and say the most compassionate, helpful, empowering thing to the person who's in front of us. And one of the other hard things about this job is that what you say is going to be different for every person, right? That in some cases, some people are just beating themselves up so much over a tiny failure. And your whole job as a leader and mentor is to say, it's not a big deal. Forget about it. Just don't even think about it. Go into lab today and try to fail, because, you're so afraid of failure that, this was my boss when I was a grad student had to tell me, he's like, go out there and try to get a B or try to make your experiment fail. Just don't worry about it. But then there are times where someone has a personality that might be a little bit blasé about failure. And you're like, okay, so the same thing has happened 3 times now.
Right.
And we need to talk about why this isn't changing. And maybe I need to help you understand why this is really, really important for our lab. That if you're not getting these results, it's hurting the future of our ability to keep doing research. And so it's finding that right thing that some people feel very little about failing. Some people feel a lot about failing, and you need to dial everyone to the middle of let's get to a place where it bothers us enough that we want to learn and we want to grow and we want to do our best and not make that mistake again. But we're able to use that as a motivator to do better rather than as something that just crushes us psychologically.
Yeah, no, I love that. Trying to dial people to the middle. That's a good way of saying that, and recognizing, that with the different personalities in a team, figuring out what makes each person tick and what's the right approach or the right thing to say.
It's another one of the skills we're never taught. Nobody took me aside and was like, hey, Jen,
figure that out.
Here's how you do this. I had to figure it out by failing a lot. I still fail often at this.
Yeah. Well, so that leads me to another question I was going to ask. This is talked about in Amy's book, but I would love to talk about it here, of why you share your failures. And to paraphrase what was in the book, why it's more important for those with more power to share their mistakes.
Yes, it absolutely is more important the more power we get. And that is because largely we have more privilege. I think it's healthy for everyone to share their failures. I think the impact of sharing your failures is independent of career stage, that it is just as powerful for someone who is a high schooler or an undergrad or whatever career stage to be sharing their failures as a university president to be doing that. But I also think that there's it takes some privilege to fail, and it takes some privilege to be able to share your failures. And so the more privilege people have, the more they're able to share a mistake without that fear of being judged or having their capabilities questioned or having it impact their future job prospects. The more you can, the further up you are, the more you can do that. And so the more responsibility we have. And now I got at this in a little bit of a sideways way, because I actually had a massive failure in that I mentioned tenure and that whole thing. And my tenure vote did not go well. I ended up getting tenure, but it was, I had a vote that should not have, I had a moment in my career where I had to sit there and say, yep, based on these data I'm looking at, this is probably the end of the road for me, and I need to find a new job. And I had to go and talk to my group about that. And, long story short, it was the best thing that ever happened in my career, because, boy, it was the worst day of my life. But then our group got through it together. We thrived out of it. And it just made me completely fearless. It made me not care what other people thought about me. I was like, I've been so worried about what will people think of me if I don't get tenure? And now I'm sitting here staring at it. And so, there's just no margin. I'm just trying to go on in my career and have a job and have this career path I want so badly. There's no margin to worry what people think about me. And I think that kind of shot me out of a cannon in a way that will never, hopefully, change or go back to what it was before. But I think it's really personal, and no one owes anything to anyone else as far as what we decide to share or our vulnerability. It should always be something that we choose to do because we see an opportunity to benefit someone else.
Yeah. And I totally agree with what you said, about privilege that comes from, position, seniority, reputation, what have you. A founder of a business has certain privilege where they can admit a mistake and their employees probably they're not going to get fired for it. But when it comes to what do you have to lose, what's the risk of speaking up? What's that vulnerability? There's often a lot of pride where people could admit their failure, but I'm not a psychologist, but people are complicated, and there's that pride factor that's part of human nature too. Or they could admit it, that just don't want to, and that's maybe more internal than it is external.
And I think some of that is a cognitive distortion, though, right? Don't you think that I often say this with feedback, that we're afraid of negative feedback because it's a little bit like a failure. We failed to live up to our own standards. But what hurts about it is that when we get that feedback, that's the moment when we become aware that someone else thinks that we've failed, but they know we've failed for a long time, right? Yeah. They know we've failed to live up to a standard in a certain way, and all of us do this. And it feels in that moment like that person is losing respect for us. But if we can get past the cognitive distortion and say, no, they've known that for a while.
Yeah.
They probably knew I failed in that way. And rather, if I can own it, rather than, my respect, the respect I have with them is dropping. It's like, no, it's at a level. And now I have an opportunity to make this right, to admit it, to talk about how I'm going to fix it, to change whatever it is that I'm getting feedback on. And it's really an opportunity to grow and to gain respect. But
right.
Of course, our brains don't see that. And so we have to be like, no, pause, let's think about, let's plow through the cognitive distortion and think about what's really going on here.
Yeah. A leader who doesn't want to admit that they're imperfect might think they're protecting their team. They're probably more likely protecting their own sense of something, because like you said, if you've worked with anyone long enough, I mean, none of us are perfect. And I think it would be rare for a team to think their boss was perfect and that you're going to burst that bubble and they're all going to quit because they thought they came to work for perfection.
Yeah, but it's so hard, right? For a long time, I used to, when I would go work out in the middle of the day, I would sneak to the locker, to the bathroom that has the changing room, change into my running clothes and sneak outside, because I was worried people would think I wasn't working hard enough. If I was going for a run at 2 p.m.
That's back when you cared.
That's back when I still feel that. And then I realized, no, if I want people in my lab to feel like they can really do this, because we have a flexible work hours policy, right? Science does not work on a 9-to-5 schedule. And so we often don't either. And then I realized, gosh, if I'm not openly following this policy, then nobody else is going to feel like they can. So I think we set a model for it. But I'm sure you've seen this done poorly too, though, right? If I show up the first time our grant got rejected and say, well, that's it, the reviewers hated our grant, it's all a total loss. I guess our research is terrible. And I don't know what we do from here. Have a good day, right? That's not a good way to do it.
Right.
But obviously, if you can show up and be hopeful and say, okay, this is what it was, we failed, but we're gonna get through it, then there's good and bad ways to do this as well. I'm sure you've seen your share of both of those.
Yeah, you want to try to help create a vision for a future where things will work out, and it's more of a Silicon Valley expression maybe, but failing forward as opposed to failing and saying, okay, we're not going to try getting up.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Jen, this has been such a great conversation here. Thank you for your story and your insights. You have a book that you're working on.
I do.
Tell us about that. I know just a little bit. I would love to hear more, and I'm sure the listeners would too.
Yes. So I will use the line that actually opens my acknowledgments, which is that chemistry professors don't typically write leadership books. But that's what I did. Yeah. And it was really this realization that we've talked about in this podcast of, gosh, I have this job I wasn't trained for. And the people I lead, those early career researchers, they're really counting on me to get it right. And there's a whole lot of us out there who are living the same story. I would come to appreciate that as I travel around and talk to other faculty. And so the book is called Accidental Leadership, subtitled tentatively, Being Great, How to Be Outstanding at the Job You Were Never Trained For. Oh. And I know it's a shared experience, because when I tell other faculty or other leaders my title, often they will laugh. And it's like, okay, yes, you get it.
That's a great title.
You've been there. Thanks. Yeah, it's basically a leadership guide for anyone who wasn't trained to be a leader, but has found themselves in that position. And it's centered around leading a research lab, but it really applies to just about any domain. Whether you're navigating conflict or modeling failure or thinking about how you set vision and goals, it's got something for you.
Yeah. It'll have a lot of applications. Again, I think, physicians, who become accidental leaders. And see, this might benefit you. They might go and Google something like, I've accidentally become a leader.
Yes, and then hopefully they find my book. Yes.
And then potential follow-up while I'm goofing around about all this. I'm excited to hear about the book. But I can't help but say, well, maybe a follow-up is accidental author.
Yes.
About how to write a leadership book.
Oh my goodness. Yes. Well, and that's where it was so fortuitous that Amy Edmondson had reached out to me. I think it was summer of 2021. And I had started writing my book actually at the start of 2020. And I was going along a chapter a month. And that went great for the first 3 chapters.
Yeah. And then 2020. Yeah.
Yeah. And then March 2020 hit. And so I was just digging my way back towards starting to write again. And she reached out to me, and I had just finished writing a chapter that talked a lot about psychological safety. I was talking about giving and receiving feedback. And so I'm sitting there. I was actually on family vacation, which is like, don't tell, I like check my email on family vacation. And I see this email pop up, and I'm totally fangirling in the car as we're driving back from our family hike. And like to my spouse, I'm like, John, Amy Edmondson emailed me, and we're going to talk, and it's going to be amazing. And she was actually someone who gave me a lot of encouragement then about being able to finish writing a book, because there's not a lot of that around when you're a science professor, of people teaching you how to write a leadership book. But that's where being in a university is really fun too. You've got friends who do all sorts of different things, and a lot of them have given me now advice to kind of push it across the line. And so, yeah, it still feels a long way off, because it'll come out next summer, but it is off to production and copy editing and all of those happy things right now. So I'm very excited.
Well, good. Well, I want to keep in touch with you about the book. And I've been doing a series of, I've interviewed people, and then they had a book come out of doing just a short follow-up to say, hey, the book's available now. So we'll hopefully get to do that next summer.
I would absolutely love to do that. And yes, I can talk about accidental authorship as well, because it was definitely that. It started over a glass of wine, a few glasses of wine with my spouse. And I admitted that people had been telling me I should write a book. And I said, nah, but I can never do it. And he said, well, what would it look like to try?
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that was like the perfect, best, worst thing you could have said to me right now. And that set it off.
The best way to write a good book is to start by writing a bad first draft.
Yes. Yeah. I think I said, I will outline for a year. I said, my travel's bonkers this year. If I need to do this, I have to cut back my travel. So this year I won't write, I'll just outline. And then at some point I said, got an outline with 25,000 words. I should probably write a book.
Yeah. That's beyond outline. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you carried that forward, and look forward to the book coming out next summer. So again, we've been joined by Jennifer Heemstra from Washington University in St. Louis, author of the upcoming book. See, we can say that now. Yes. The upcoming book, Accidental Leadership. So thank you so much for accepting the invitation to be here today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was really fun to talk.